Hello, bruv. We're back with The Black Knight by Mrs. Alfred Sidgwick, Crosbie, Garstin, and we're on chapter 3. Oh no, we lost our place. Chapter 3. Dawn sprang up over the plains, flooding the eastern sky with a glowing golden tide on which clouds floated like shreds of flame-colored seaweed. It flooded the emigrant car, washing away sleep. Men and women stirred, sat up, and rubbed eyes, sighing. The chatter of many tongues, Swedish, German, Polish, English, began again. Children called to each other. A baby crowed delightedly, stretching out its fingers on the window as though to grasp the miraculous sunflower of dawn. Yawning men kicked off their blankets and clumped to the lavatory, whence came the splutter of taps, splashings, and blowings. Michael pulled a towel and soap out of his bag and took his place in the queue. The red-headed man shouldered his way out, shaking drops of water off his nose. "Get a hustle on, boy," he said. "We ought to be there in 10 minutes, and she don't stop so that you'd notice it. Lend me a wipe, will you?" Somebody's lifted mine. These here square-head emigrants would steal the hair out of a dirty comb. He chafed his glistening face vigorously in Michael's towel, slung it back to him, and plunged into the coach. Michael had barely soused his head and hands when the engine bell commenced its dolorous clamor and the brakes jarred on. He rushed, dripping, back to his berth, clutched together his few belongings, and jumped for the trackside just as the train got underway again. Steve Whitty regarded him, twinkling. "Told you she wouldn't linger long enough to lick a postage stamp," he grinned. "Well, now you're here. Take your collar out of your mouth and doll yourself up. We'll go and bark some breakfast. Hello, Obed." He turned to greet a tall, incredibly thin ancient who was slouching towards them, thumbs hitched in his braces, a nautical cap pulled so far over his eyes that he had to lift his head back to see out under it. "Herm," grunted the ancient in response, and halting watched Michael's struggles with his tie with scornful interest. "Anything doing?" Steve Whitty inquired. The ancient transferred the straw he was sucking from the right to the left side of his mouth. "Lieberman loaded the Carl Hogs Tuesday. May Ladner had her fifth Thursday, a colt." "Busy week," Steve commented. "Well, come on, boy. Don't you let yourself be fascinated with Obed and forget your victuals. He gets a rush of conversation to the head now and again, and there's no stopping him. Come on." Michael picked up his bag and followed his new employer around the depot house. "Say, Steve," Whitty halted. "Yep." Obed transferred his straw from the left to the right side. "There's a team of yorn in my barn." Steve turned about interested. "How did it get there?" "Your father bringed it on Saturday night, said you'd fetch it." Steve considered. "Saturday night? About what time?" "About 11. There's a westbound train going by at about 11:30, ain't there?" "Yes, why?" "Oh, nothing." The pair walked on into the town, Steve humming happily some piece of news. The advent of Mary Ladner's fifth, perhaps, had pleased him evidently. The township of MacGillivray had taken its name from that of its founder and oldest inhabitant, a hairy Shetland Islander, who in the early days had set up shop there to trade with the Indians, and who could still be seen, a bent old figure, all white hair and fur cap, shuffling round the village wearing the distressful, puzzled expression of a dog whose kennel has outgrown him. With the advent of white settlers, other more modern traders had come, taking most of the Shetlanders' business from him. But they could not rob him of his immortality. The place was always known by the name of the old store, MacGillivray's, and was shown on the Dominion maps as such. It had never known great prosperity, however, and in Anno Domini 1908 consisted of a double row of single-storied frame houses straddling a roll of the prairies, the grass of which pushed right up to its back doors and invaded its single street. Steve Whitty led the way along the plank sidewalk, and halting before a weather-boarded shack, which had the sign Elite Restaurant painted in drunken letters on its false front, jerked the latch bobbin and stepped within. A table covered with clean oilcloth ran the length of the room. On one wall hung a portrait of Queen Victoria, on another a view of old Fort Garry, Winnipeg that is, log cabins built to form three sides of a square, a group of Hudson Bay factors lounging about the cannon, and a flagstaff in the center. "Mrs. Spriggs, Spriggs," shouted Steve Whitty. "Who's that?" A querulous female voice inquired from some inner chamber. "Me, Steve, but I thought you was in Montreal." "You got another think coming, then. But Obed certainly told me that you was in Montreal." Steve cursed softly. "All right, have it your own way. I ain't going to argue with you. I am in Montreal, if you like, but my own twin brother is in your elite hash parlor right now, hollering for some eats." No call for you to holler or to get fresh either." What the fuck is this? Snapped the voice. "If you want to eat, you know what to do about it, don't you? You oughter by this time." All right, Steve soothed, and entering the little kitchen at the back of the dining room, rummaged in the meat safe. "There ought to be 5 sausages and a couple of rashers in there," came the voice of Mrs. Spriggs again. "If they ain't enough for you, go out to the hen house and grab an egg or 2. Your friend can set the table while you're doing it." While Steve fried the bacon and sausages, Michael, under the direction of the invisible Mrs. Spriggs, set the plates and cutlery out. Preparations complete, they sat down to meat, Steve carrying on a spirited conversation on topics of the hour with their hostess through the matchboard partition. His pangs of hunger mollified, Steve sponged his plate clean with a crust of bread, swallowed the crust, sluiced it down with the dregs of his coffee, transferred the stains from his mouth to the back of his hand, and from thence to the seat of his trousers, and crept silently towards the door. Mrs. Spriggs was too quick for him, however. "Hi, where you off to? You ain't washed up," she shrilled. Steve halted, grinning guiltily. "I was going to chuck a bit of grain to your fowls." The lady grunted. "You was going in the wrong direction, then. You'd best wash up first, or you'll be forgetting again, like you did last time." Steve sighed, and returning bore the dirty plates into the kitchen. In 10 minutes, he reported all in order. "That'll be 2 bits each, then," said Mrs. Spriggs. "Put the money in the pickle jar on the shelf. I've got a good mind to charge you more for frying your sausages in butter instead of lard, but I'll let it go this time if you draw me a pail of water." Steve winked admiringly. "She's got her eye clamped to a hole in the wall and hair's as long as a mule," he whispered to Michael. "Can't fool her none." "All right, old dear," he shouted. "I'll do all you say and buck you a bit of wood as make weight." "Well, that beats anything I've met with yet," said Michael, as they at length closed the door of the Elite Restaurant behind them. Where on earth was the woman all the time? Steve shrugged his shoulders. "In bed, I guess. Why doesn't she get up, then?" "Got no legs," said Steve. "No legs? How in the name of mischief can she expect to run a restaurant like that?" "She don't. She expects it to run itself," Steve retorted. "And ain't you just seen it doing it?" They found Obed standing at the entrance of his livery barn, which, with the United Baptist Free Church, was the only 2-storied edifice in McGilvray. Chewing his after-breakfast straw and absorbed in the antics of a couple of retriever puppies. "You'll find your team up at the far end, Steve," he drawled. "They feeling kinder good this morning. That bald face aimed to chaw my leg off when I went to feed him." "Been standing in, that's why," said Steve. "Give that baldy a day off, and he's so plumb full of high living you got her soothe him with a club to get the harness on him." He turned to Michael. "Oh, wait, the Pinto ain't much better for the matter of that." He turned to Michael. "Hey, son, there's likely to be doings around this barn in a minute or 2, and as I don't want to see a hoss put his foot through you on your first day, I guess you'd Best light out till the smoke has subsided some. Me and Obed will fix him. You hike round to Fred's saloon and tell him to give you 6 bottles of rye from me and wait there till I pick you up, see?" Michael obediently returned to Main Street, and tracing a strong scent of alcohol to its source, entered a long, weather-boarded shanty. A squat, snub-nosed, mop-headed individual, presumably Fred, reclined on a tilted chair behind the counter, reading the current copy of the Calgary Eye-Opener. The stump of a dead cigar in the corner of his mouth, his slippered feet resting on the bar. Without removing his eyes from the paper, he reached for an uncorked bottle of Canadian Club whiskey on the shelf behind him and pushed it and a glass across the counter. Michael set them to one side and repeated Steve's injunctions. The bartender dragged his reluctant eyes from the absorbing literature and stared at Michael in amazement. "Who are you, kid?" Michael introduced himself. "But Steve's got a hired man. What the hell does he want with 2? Fred queried. "Thinks the other may be leaving," said Michael. "What for?" Michael did not know. The bartender sniffed. "Oh, well, I guess that's his business, not mine. But did I hear you say you wanted 6 bottles of hooch, kid?" "6? Sure." Michael nodded. Fred's thick eyebrows disappeared under his fringe. Great curling snakes. What's come over him? He ain't taken so much as a flask home in 3 years, not since that Eastern woman married the poor mutt and tied him up short. He's getting all fired and courageous all of a sudden. Here you are, above." He produced the required articles from under the counter, tilted his chair back again, and resumed his reading. As Michael, a trio of bottles under each arm, stepped out into Main Street, a pair of frantic horses dashed past him, trailing a light Democrat wagon in their spurting dust. Steve Whitty, scarlet in the face and blaspheming at the top of his voice, sat with both feet lodged against the dashboard, sawing at the reins with all of his might. "Jump for it next time I come around," he shouted to Michael, and disappeared in the cloud of his own dust. Michael gripped his bottles as firmly as he could, took up a position in the center of the street, and waited. Presently, the white Roman nose of the nearest side horse shot round the corner, and in another moment the buggy was on him. He made a dart to get in over the offside, but the hind wheel caught him above the elbow, knocking him back and over. "Be round again in a minute," yelled Steve, undismayed, and was gone once more. Obed shuffled towards him from the sidewalk. "Aiming to bust your gall-darn neck?" he inquired dryly, his straw chafing gently against his right nostril. "That ain't no ways for to embark in a Democrat. Get in over the back like a Christian. I'll stop him." Michael picked himself and the bottles out of the dust and waited again. He did not have to wait long. Once more the white nose shot past the corner, and the wagon came bumping and bounding towards him. As it drew level, Steve shortened his grip and flung all of his weight against the horses' mouths. At the same moment, Obed, suddenly galvanized into action, withdrew his hands from his trouser pockets, threw them widespread into the air, and gave vent to a single ear-piercing whoop. The horses, checked by the wrench on their bits and the scarecrow apparition which had sprung up shrieking in their path, dug their toes in and slid to a momentary stop. Michael had just time to tumble in over the backboard, and they were off again. Obed eluded the pinto horse's shoulder by a quick incurving of his back, and without another glance to see how the Democrat or its occupants were faring, began to search the dirt of Main Street for his lost straw. Michael bounced on his back at the bottom of the wagon, clutching bottles to his bosom. "All right?" Steve inquired from the front seat. "Yes, I'm all right, thanks," Michael panted. "God's teeth, you don't think I'm fretting about you?" snorted the perspiring Jehu. "Is all them ryes aboard?" Michael counted. "Yes, more or less. I've got 5. One's broken. It's damned uncomfortable sitting on the chips. I wish you'd pull up those horses." "I wish I could. They're drawing the whole darned outfit of their mouths right now, and my arms is pretty nigh pulled off their hinges. They'll run on like this till they hit the slope of the Coyote Hills. Can you pray?" "I suppose so. Why?" "Then pray old man Niper's gate is open," said Steve, and lapsed into silence. Fortunately for them, old man Kuiper's gate was open. They flashed through the long barrier of wires, the Democrats off hub missing the gate post by the fraction of an inch, and headed the steaming horse up the long, smooth slope slope of the Coyotes. Gradually, acclivity began to tell, and Steve hauled them into a trot, and from a trot to a walk. "Climb over and sit on the seat with me now," said he to Michael. "Didn't like to risk it before. You might have been bucked out and busted another bottle. What are you groaning for?" "I'm black and blue from bouncing about on the bottom, clutching your confounded cellar," Michael grumbled, climbing over the seat back. "I reckon I've earned my $1.35 today, anyhow." Steve crowed derisively. "Shucks, you don't call this work, do you? This is pleasure riding, this is." "Is it? I'm glad you told me, otherwise I should never have suspected it." Steve laughed. "Great little old horses to burn the breeze, ain't they?" He flicked the pinto's rump affectionately. "Whitty's whizzers, they call 'em in town. My wife's ma came out from the east to visiting us last fall. I went into a town to meet her. The old lady wouldn't sit up here with me, and facing the engine always made her sick, so she elected to squat on her box at the back of the rig. These yer critters was feeling plumb full of expression that morning, and we went out of town zip. Bingo! I had my hands full, and overflowing couldn't pay no attention to the old lady. I didn't choke the cusses down till we reached just about where we are now, and so help me Bob, when I looked, there weren't a sign of my wife's ma nor her box. I turned around and chased back in McGilvery, hell-bent for election. When I pulled up at the depot, I seed Obed standing on the track, watching the smoke of a train. "Seen anything of my wife's ma?" I asked him. "Yep," says he. "You done dumped her off at the corner of Main Street." "Where is she now?" says I. "In that there train going back east," says he. Steve chuckled and flipped the reins along the backs of his demon team. "Hold on to them rise, for dear love's sake," he implored. "We're just about at the top now, and they'll be off again in a minute." Miles below and behind them, a tiny huddle of buildings marked the position of McGilvery, a shaft of sunshine striking fire from the corrugated iron roof of Obed's livery barn. A long freight train crawled westwards, trailing a gray ostrich plume of smoke. Further northward, still the plains flowed again to a misty horizon as blue and level as the line of some inland sea. Southwards and before them the wheat-burdened prairies swelled and sank in gentle rounded billows, a cloth of gold embroidered with the green and silver of poplar bluffs and gemmed with the turquoise of sun-sparkled sloughs. Here and there were dotted little wooden farmsteads, like primitive dolls' houses, their chimneys smoking cheerfully. Faintly downwind came the halloo of a man calling to his horses, and the clickety-click, and the click-click of a binder as it sheared into the wind-rippled seas of wheat. Steve Whitty included the whole panorama with a sweep of his whip. "Good country, God's country," he said, and chirruped to his team. They plunged into their breast collars, and once more the Democrat went swinging and lurching down the trail. He was in excellent good humor, was Steve. He shouted good morning to flocks of party-colored canaries, which sat along the fence, wires like beads on a string, whooped at little rat-like gophers, sending them bobbing back into their holes, and spying an old brown badger shrinking unobtrusively through a spray of wolf willows. He wished it a Merry Christmas and trusted all was well at home. When there was nothing by the wayside to shout at, he sang at the top of his voice melancholy dirges about dying cowboys who with their parting breaths implored that they might not be buried on the lone prairie, but who nevertheless were promptly interred where they dropped. In a narrow grave 6 foot by 3, they buried him there on the lone prairie. Thus singing and shouting, he whiled the long miles away, and as the sun stood at its noontide zenith, swung his team off the high trail into a little byway that plunged eastwards through the cotton bluffs. 100 yards further on, he pulled the horses up, and handing the reins to Michael, dropped to the ground and peered through a gap in the trees for the space of 2 minutes. Whatever he saw satisfied him, apparently, for he climbed back into the wagon, whistling cheerily, and clucked to his beast. They shot out of the cotton bluffs into a clearing in the center of which stood a good 2-storied lumber house. Its back to the north in the sheltering coppice, its face to a wide, reed-fringed slough. Steve drove the Democrat right up to the porch, hitched the horses to a post provided for that purpose, opened the house door carefully, and crept within. Michael descended stiffly to the ground, hugging his precious bottles. A mongrel sheepdog with a gray flecked coat and one faded eye wandered out of a shed, and sighting the stranger came rushing towards him, snarling and barking. Michael caught it in the chest with his foot as it sprang, rolling it over in the dust. It looked extremely satisfied, picked itself up, shook itself, and walked back whence it had come without another bark. Trio of heavy working mares with sturdy foals running at their heels galloped up from the slough edge and trotted along the fence, whinnying to the Democrat team, who rumbled in response. "Hey, Mike." Michael turned about to see Steve Whitty standing in the porch, beckoning to him. He held a piece of white notepaper crumpled in his hand and had a queer, excited glint in his eyes. "What is it?" Steve shook the scrap of paper at him. My wife has quit me." "Quit you?" Michael echoed in amazement. Steve nodded. "Yep, quit me. Gone. Fleed. Went. Skidooed. Beat it." Michael's jaw dropped. Poor old Steve to come singing, shouting, chirruping home to this? Poor old Steve. Poor old devil. "By God, I'm frightfully sorry for you," he exclaimed. "Terrible blow, ain't it?" said Steve soberly. Then all of a sudden his eyes began to twinkle, and he exploded into a ringing crow of laughter. This is definitely a barn burner. Goodbye, bruv. Until next time, Chapter 4. Goodbye.